Hi everybody. I've had a few guys ask me in the past couple of months about releathering, how I do it, and what tools I use and whatnot. So I thought I'd film a quick video or maybe a couple videos on how to do that. Now there's a few different options for releathering, depending on what kind of belt you're using. Are you releathering a figs belt, or are you releathering a bootleg belt? So this is a chunk of, it's a double shoulder, 8 ounce is what I generally use, 8 to 10 ounce. I bought it from Tandy Leather. And I'm going to pretend like I'm releathering a fig strap. Now, there's a couple different options here. One option is to put the strap down the belt and trace it out as it sits, and then poke your holes using a craft tool. Now, this is the one that I use for the figs belt because it's screw ports. It's not bolts, so the hole's going to be bigger. So I use a number 4. That's a number 4. Pardon me. That's a number 7. Excuse me. That's a number 7. For the figs. But the reason I don't typically do that anymore is because the figs cuts are usually they're wrong. So a good starting point for me is to take, if it's a figs, take the original belt, put it on the leather, and start with your main plate. Don't trace anything else out. Just start with your main plate. Okay? So you put it down here. You don't trace it out. All you do is poke your holes. So you take your tool and you put it in the hole, push down really hard in each of the main plate holes, and then remove the belt. And what you're going to have is a blank slate with, well, in this case, 6 different holes. Okay. Then you use a mallet. Looks like this. Don't use a hammer. You'll mess up your tools really badly. Use a mallet, poly mallet, again available at Tandy, to poke all the holes right through the bottom of the leather. So you got to hit it really hard, and it'll poke your holes. Now, if you're doing a boot, boots don't have screw ports, most of them. Most boots have bolts. So this is an example of a strap that I messed up a while ago. It's the same kind of belt. This is a bulldog tag, but the idea is the same. And so you'll notice it's the same principle. Pretend this isn't cut out of the leather yet, but basically what I did was I took the, in the case of a boot, you take the plate itself, so the main plate, all right, and your piece of leather, okay? And then what you do is you take something that's curved and put it underneath it, underneath the big leather. Okay. Now your plates are going to be curved, so you have to make sure you match that curve as exactly as possible. I typically just use another belt, one that's bigger. So for example, an undisputed. So I've got my undisputed belt underneath there to match the curve. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my main plate on the bootleg, which I unfortunately don't actually have with me for this example. I'm going to wet the leather first, really lightly with a sponge. Make sure the water's clean around the main plate. Okay, get it good and wet. And then you take the main plate from your boot, you put it on top of here, and you press. Don't press too hard. You can break the bolts. Okay, but you want to make sure it's not angled too far so that your strap's running off that way. But you take it, and as straight as you can, you put it in the middle, and you press down. Okay, and you might have to wobble it a little bit, but be careful not to move it side to side or up and down. Then you'll remove your plate, and you're going to have the same principle as the other one. You're going to have a bunch of little dots. Okay, now, those dots represent your screw ports. Or your bolts, rather, because boots have bolts. So you've got your main plate. Don't worry about all this. And you've got your bolts. You do the same basic thing, except with boots, because they're using bolts instead of screw ports, you use a slightly smaller punch, which is I typically use number 4. So 7 for the ports, 4 for bolts, and you go around and you punch out your holes for the bolts. Then you take the main plate from the boot and you run the bolts through the leather. Okay, now this is going to be a gigantic piece of leather. Pretend we haven't cut this yet. But you run it through the bolts through the leather, run it through the holes, the bolts through the holes, so that your main plate is basically stuck to the leather. Then, being very careful, you trace around the main plate. Now, if you're doing a painted replica, this is a totally different thing. You cannot draw on a painted replica strap with any kind of pen because there's no dye to cover it. The paint is a very thin coat, and if you draw any color on this, it will not work. So if you're using a black, most straps are black, okay, I just use a felt tip pen, and very lightly, once I've got the plate on here, I trace the outline of the main plate around the leather, so that when you remove the main plate, you have an idea of what it looks like. Okay, you have an idea of what the shape of that main plate and where it's going to sit. Okay, if you are doing painted what I do instead of drawing, I use a little spoon. So you wet it first before you do this. And I use a little spoon tool. This is another Tandy special. Really lightly tracing around so I get an idea of where the main plate sits. Then again, I remove the main plate so I have an outline of the main plate. Okay, so once you have your outline of your main plate, you need to draw a line down the middle. As you see, I've got one here from left to right. This one's kind of crude because I fucked it up. WWF is the right way, and WWF is upside down. But anyway, you got to draw your line. So I'll show you what I use. So I use a 6-foot level, goes way across the piece of leather, and I determine where the middle of the plate is. So you need to measure up and make sure you have the exact middle point of the plate, okay? And then you draw your line. Now again, pretend this isn't cut yet. It's just on one big piece of leather. Okay, so from one end to the other, you draw a line. Again, I use black ink for a black belt, very lightly, so you can barely see it. You can see here. Okay, if you're doing a painted replica, you can't do this. Okay, if you're using dye, you can find a pen that matches the dye. So I've done purple before. That was the Intercontinental WWF I did. The oval. I've done red before for a Universal. So you can do it really lightly. In most cases, the dye will cover it. You can always test. But if you're doing a painted replica, don't draw anything on it. No lines. Okay, so now you've got your main plate, and you've got a line determining the middle all the way along the belt. Fine. Okay, so the next step is tracing out the plate. So what I use is this same spoon tool comes with a little arm on it. Okay, so with a plate that has a really irregular top like this, or if you're using the World Heavyweight, okay, what I do is I take, so again, pretend this leather just continues. All you've got here is a black line. You wet the leather first, really lightly, again, okay? And then you place this end along here and really carefully follow along and trace. Now, obviously, I'm trying to hold a camera while doing this, so this is a friggin' disaster. And it's not set to the correct depth. But you get the idea, right? So you can follow along so it follows the top contour of the belt and the bottom. Leave yourself more room than you think you need. But you can also, in doing this, change the size of the cut of the main plate. So, for example, I recently did a smoking skull. And the smoking skull replica on the figs, it has the wrong leather cut. Okay, so you can change that. So you see I put a tiny little lip along the bottom and a little bit more on the top because that's, as far as I could tell, what was done with the original replica. Okay, so you can change that to suit your needs or whatever you want to do with the belt. Okay, so once you've got that, you want to trace to about, well, when I did this one, I traced to either wingtip along the top and along the bottom, about to here of the belt. And you can see from here, it branches out, okay? And then it winds up in it. Now, this one is a straight line, but the original was not a straight line. It was a tapered kind of thing. It's a J-mar. So, same basic principle. I used the tool to go along the top there to the wingtip. Okay, and it'll change depending on each individual belt. And then you've got to come up with something that matches this curve here and here, and here and here. Okay, so you can use any number of different things to do that. I typically find an object like a large circle, or I've got a whole bunch of these things here. These are awesome. They're super helpful to trace this curve and this curve. Take my advice. Once you get to a point where it's a straightaway, use a ruler. Okay? Use a ruler. All right? It's so important. Okay? And after you're done that, don't trace the original contour of the belt is what I mean. Use a ruler and use a square. Both extremely important tools for releathering. So, now that you've got your thing traced to about here, you want to put your side plates on. Okay, so you've got an outline of your main plate. Move this out of the way. A stack of belts out here. Move your main plate. You've got your trace of your main plate. So you need to determine how far apart you want your plates to be. Different original belts had different spacing. You can just Google pictures of the original belt or the belt from Access, or the other Releather videos are really helpful with this too. And you come up with a space between each plate. Okay, I use this caliper. You can get digital calipers, but I use an old-fashioned one. And you measure, make sure this distance is equal, make sure this distance is equal, and make sure it's equal from top to bottom. and on both sides, so it's centered. Okay, and you do the same thing with the second plate and a property plate if you have one. This one doesn't. Okay, so once you've determined, you take the side plates, you set them on there. Don't push too hard. Well, actually, sorry, you wet the leather first, then you put the side plates on there, and you get all this in order, right? You space to make sure everything's right. Same as the main plate, you push down. Don't use too much pressure, you'll break the bolts on a boot. Okay, if you're using a Figs replica, you can impression the screw ports, or you can simply use the original strap. It's up to you. But if you're using a boot, you push down on here, and then same principle, you get an idea of where your bolts stand once you've got your plates spaced equally, and you poke your holes. Same idea. Now again, the boot, it's smaller. It's number 4 and a number 7 with a Figs replica. Okay. All right. Once you've gotten the impression of your side plates, you put the side plates on there and you trace them out, so you see exactly where they're going to sit. Okay, and then I use this same tool to determine how far it is from here to here and from here to here, making sure everything's equal. Now, your snap boxes. This is the hardest part to do on a belt in my experience. So I'll bring this one back up here, because most of you aren't going to be doing the old Bulldog style. Most of you are going to be looking at, this is a JMR. But, so what you do is, this, the width of this is 4 inches from top to bottom. And same with the other side, top to bottom, 4 inches. Okay, so what I typically do is I decide where on the leather I want this 4-inch thing to start. Okay, usually it's somewhere in the middle of the property plate if you have one. Okay, and then you mark it, and you draw a straight line using your ruler from this point to this point, and then from this point. And I typically leave myself a lot of space. You don't worry about the end just yet. We'll figure that out later. But you just right off the end. You'll have lots of excess leather. You can always have too much. If you have too little, you're screwed. Okay, so right off the end. Okay, and then you basically should have an outline of what the belt will look like. Okay, now for cutting it, I use, and every Releather has a different tactic. I use a utility knife. Now this one's kind of worn, but I have a special one. Use a brand new blade. Go out and buy blades. If you don't have brand new blades, you're going to fuck the whole thing up. Now, a Releather, an actual leather worker will tell you that's blasphemy. Never, never, never use a utility knife. I've done a lot of Releathers. They work great as long as they're sharp. Okay. Now, for these areas here, you've got to be really careful that you follow your lines, because if you're a millimeter out, it'll look all wonky. Okay. For the straightaways, once you hit a straightaway, okay, I take a ruler, I put it on the leather, I push down, not too hard because you don't want to leave an impression from the ruler, and I cut using this. Okay, it just makes for a straighter line. I do the same thing along the bottom, and then I cut the curves freehand, and then, pardon me, same thing here. Once you're cutting your original leather, you take straight away here, right off the end of the belt. So you're going to wind up with something that looks a little bit like this. Okay, you've got your plates drawn out. Your main plate drawn out, you've got them all spaced, you've got a property plate there if you want it. This is all going to be blank. This is all a beveled line. Don't worry about that. And yours will likely go way off the end and way off the end on this side. Okay, don't worry about that. We can figure that out later, but you've got your basic cut for the belt itself. So the last step is cutting the end of the belt. Now, So you've got your plates traced out, you've got your leather cut in a straight line or in a curve, whatever the case may be, depending on the belt you're actually doing, but you've used rulers to do all the cutting. This end piece is 4 inches, and you've determined that using your square. So you hold it on here on your center line, okay, and you make sure it's 2 and 2, top and bottom, okay, and it's going to extend further than what you want the belt to be. We did that on purpose, okay. So in order to determine how far out you want to go. So you basically, what I typically do is I'll measure belts I've already done and determine how much space I need for a snap box. Okay, so typically the measurement from the end of the tip to the this line here, the end of the snap box on a 2x8 is 11, and on a 2x5 is about 8 inches. Okay, that's with snaps spaced 1 inch apart. Okay, now we're not going to worry about tooling all the snap box right now. That'll take forever. Leave yourself more room than you think you need, okay, on any belt, especially if you're doing a Milliken, like this is a Milliken IC strap. If you're doing a Milliken belt, like give yourself a little more room. It can't hurt. Okay, so you want to measure, you get an idea of, so this is where my last plate ends, or my property plate, depending on which belt I'm doing. I'm going to give myself an extra inch of space, and then I'm going to use this to measure over from here, okay, and measure over, it would be 8 on the short side, 2 by 5, and 11 on this side. That's just the measurements I use. And then you've got an idea of where your belt ends. So what I typically do is I will, because this is all square and level, this line and this line, right? You measured before you cut it. You determine the point at which you want your belt to end. And because this is square, you can use that as a line and draw a line. Again, if you're doing dye, use a line that's the same color as the belt you're dyeing. If you're painting, I use the spoon, this thing. Don't draw on without the spacer, but don't draw on as I said, a painted belt or a painted belt you're going to paint. Same thing on this side. You determine where your belt is going to end based on the size of the snap box. You draw a straight line. So then what you have is your belt. It's basically a rectangle. So you've got to determine these curves. That's the next step. Okay. So you could cut it in a straight line. Don't do that yet. Okay. It's a little easier to cut Milliken belts. What I do is you can actually use this as a template. And just draw it. I don't do that anymore. I use these circle things. You find a circle on one of these stencils that kind of matches this, right? That's what I do. Again, you can just use this as a template, but you need to make sure it's perfectly like level and square, otherwise it'll stick out like a sore thumb. So this is a Milliken cut. I typically find one that sort of matches. And if you're, so the Milliken typically, oh, shit. So, ends up like that, okay? I basically drew a straight line, found the circle that matched, but the same idea if you're doing a, using the trace of the replica strap. I've done that before. It has worked for me. Okay, now this is different because this is an old Parks design, I think. If you're doing Jamar is a lot harder to do because his aren't square. They're more rounded kind of on the end. Sorry for the shitty camera work. For a long time, all I did was just trace this. Okay, you can do it the other way that I said, so you draw a straight line, and then it's just more of a curve and it's harder to match. So if you're new to belt making, I would just trace this. Okay, at the end you have to make sure that it's lined up perfectly, because if it's like this, you're dinked. It won't line up. So like this, you draw your line. Now I cannot stress enough, once you've drawn your line, you have to be so careful that your knife isn't curved when you're cutting it. Okay, because if it's curved like this or curved like this, or if you're not exactly on the line when you're cutting the Jamar tip, or any of the tips, but especially Jamar, this is the finickiest part. Okay, doing the snap box on any particular belt, it's by far the hardest because a tiny little error will stick out like a sore thumb. Okay, so yeah, so that's just the basic of cutting a strap for a replica belt. Now that's if you're doing both a figs or a boot. If you want to change the leather cut, I'm going to post a separate video with using the Intercontinental as an example, because the figs, a lot of their cuts are wrong. The Intercontinental is the worst. It's so far off. So I changed my cut to match TV. So I'm going to film a separate video how you turn it into looks more like that. Okay, thanks for watching.